Listen, UN Security Council. You issued red-level sanctions against my country, the most severe punishment category. That era of using sanctions to control Africa is over. I rejected them. And I will never comply. It was your last mistake. Now get ready for my response. Let me tell you exactly what I said in those 11 minutes that left you speechless. My foreign minister burst into my office. Mr. President, Security Council just issued red-level sanctions against Burkina Faso. Immediate asset freezes, travel bans, arms embargo. Trade restrictions, most severe category, effective immediately. I read the resolution, drafted by France, co-sponsored by United States and United Kingdom, passed with Russian and Chinese abstentions. The accusations were vague: human rights violations, democratic backsliding, regional destabilization, threat to international peace and security. No specifics, no documentation, no proof, just Western powers deciding I'm threat and using Security Council as enforcement mechanism. When does Security Council meet? Emergency session, tomorrow, 1,400 hours New York time. We have right to address Council. I made instant decision. I'm going myself. I'm addressing Security Council personally. They want to punish Burkina Faso. They're going to hear from me directly. 24 hours later, I walked into UN Security Council chamber. Western ambassadors looked uncomfortable. They'd expected diplomatic protest, not African president confronting them face to face. Security Council president announced, President Traoré has 11 minutes. 11 minutes, I smiled. 11 minutes to destroy their entire justification. I began. Yesterday, this council imposed red-level sanctions on Burkina Faso. Asset freezes, travel bans, arms embargo, trade restrictions, most severe sanctions category, reserved for nations threatening international peace and security. I paused. Burkina Faso. Population 22 million. GDP $19 billion. Military budget $400 million. This council determined that my country, one of world's poorest nations, poses threat to international peace and security, requiring maximum sanctions. The absurdity was obvious. Let me address accusations: human rights violations, democratic backsliding, regional destabilization, threat to international peace. Let's examine each claim. First, human rights violations. Resolution provides no specifics, no documentation, no evidence, just vague accusations. I looked directly at French ambassador. France drafted this resolution. France claims human rights concerns, but France provides no proof, no investigation results, no verified incidents. If this council truly cared about human rights in Africa, where are sanctions against nations with documented violations? Where are sanctions against regimes killing protesters? Where are sanctions against governments imprisoning journalists? I named specific countries, nations with proven human rights abuses, governments supported by Western powers. These nations have documented violations, verified by UN investigations, confirmed by international organizations, yet no sanctions. Why? Because they cooperate with Western interests. Burkina Faso's crime isn't human rights violations. Burkina Faso's crime is independence. We closed foreign military bases. We expelled intelligence networks. We built Continental Alliance. That's why we're sanctioned. French ambassador tried to interrupt. Point of order. I have the floor. I continued. Second accusation, democratic backsliding. Translation: Burkina Faso doesn't follow Western democracy model. We choose African solutions. We prioritize stability over Western-approved elections. But let's discuss democracy. France, sponsor of these sanctions, maintains military bases across Africa, intervenes in African elections, supports coups against democratically elected leaders. United States co-sponsor has military presence in over 70 countries, conducts drone strikes without host nation approval, supports authoritarian regimes throughout Middle East and Africa. United Kingdom co-sponsor colonized quarter of world's population, drew arbitrary borders creating conflicts lasting decades. These nations question Burkina Faso's democratic credentials. Western ambassadors looked increasingly uncomfortable. Third accusation, regional destabilization. Translation: we built African Counterintelligence Alliance. We coordinated continental security. We unified African military capabilities. Western powers call this destabilization. I call it sovereignty. They call it threat. I call it protection. For decades, Africa was fragmented, individual nations facing threats alone. easy targets for foreign intervention. That fragmentation served Western interests. African Counterintelligence Alliance ended that fragmentation. Continental coordination replaced isolation, and Western powers call this destabilization. What they mean is, African unity destabilizes Western control. Continental coordination destabilizes neo-colonial system. I looked around chamber. Fourth accusation. Threat to international peace and security. This is most absurd claim. Burkina Faso threatens international peace? How? We have no nuclear weapons. We conduct no military interventions. We occupy no foreign territory. We maintain no overseas bases. We launch no drone strikes. Compare this to Security Council permanent members. United States maintains 750 military bases in 80 countries, conducts military operations in multiple nations simultaneously, spends $800 billion annually on military, but Burkina Faso is threat to peace? France conducts military operations across Africa, maintains troops in multiple African nations, but Burkina Faso is threat to peace? The comparison was devastating. Let me tell you what Burkina Faso actually threatens. We threaten neo-colonial control. We threaten foreign military bases. We threaten intelligence networks. We threaten resource exploitation. That's what we threaten. And that's why we're sanctioned. I shifted tone, but let me address real threats to international peace that this council ignores. France maintains military bases across Africa without host nation consent. Where are sanctions? United States operates drone programs killing civilians. Where is accountability? This council authorized military intervention in Libya. Result: failed state, regional instability, refugee crisis. Where is accountability for that disaster? This council imposed sanctions on Iraq based on false intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. Result: hundreds of thousands dead. Where is accountability? This council watched genocide in Rwanda, did nothing for 100 days, 800,000 murdered. Where was international peace and security then? Each accusation landed like hammer blow. This council is not about international peace and security. This council is about Western power and control. Permanent members use vetoes to protect allies, use sanctions to punish independents. Red-level sanctions against Burkina Faso prove this. We committed no aggression, we invaded no neighbors, we threatened no nations, we simply defended our sovereignty. And for that we receive maximum sanctions. But I reject these sanctions. Not just as unjust, not just as hypocritical. I reject them as illegitimate. The word hung in air, illegitimate. These sanctions are illegitimate because they're based on false accusations, no evidence of human rights violations, no proof of democratic backsliding, no demonstration of destabilization. Just Western powers punishing African sovereignty. These sanctions are illegitimate because they're imposed by hypocritical nations, nations with worse records lecturing us. These sanctions are illegitimate because they abuse UN system. Security Council designed to maintain peace, instead used to enforce neo-colonialism. Therefore, Burkina Faso rejects these sanctions. We will not comply, we will not submit, we will not accept punishment for defending our sovereignty. Gasps around chamber. And we're not alone. African Counterintelligence Alliance stands with Burkina Faso. 26 African nations reject these sanctions as illegitimate. Continental unity refusing neo-colonial punishment. Mali announces it will not enforce sanctions against Burkina Faso. Niger declares sanctions illegitimate and refuses compliance. Chad rejects sanctions as neo-colonial punishment. 26 African nations united in rejecting this council's abuse of power. The chamber erupted into chaos with delegates shouting over each other, the French ambassador rising from his seat in fury, the American representative frantically gesturing to the council president, and the British delegate calling for order while the Russian ambassador sat back with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction at Western discomfort. The gallery filled with journalists and observers burst into animated conversation, cameras flashing, reporters typing frantically on their devices, while security personnel moved nervously along the walls, uncertain whether to intervene or allow the unprecedented disruption to continue. The council president banged his gavel repeatedly, the sound lost in the cacophony of voices demanding recognition, protesting the statements, calling for procedural interventions, and arguing about whether such a coordinated rejection of Security Council authority had any precedent in the institution's 70-year history. My time is not expired. I have 3 minutes remaining. I spoke calmly but firmly, my voice cutting through the chaos, not through volume but through the absolute certainty in my tone, the refusal to be intimidated by the institutional power arrayed against me, the knowledge that every word was being broadcast live across Africa and around the world. The council president looked at his timer, confirmed that I still had speaking time remaining, and reluctantly banged his gavel again while calling for order and directing me to continue, while warning that any further disruptions from other delegations would result in the chamber being cleared. The French ambassador remained standing, clearly intending to invoke some procedural objection, but the Russian ambassador raised a point of order, noting that interfering with a member state's allotted speaking time would violate council rules, and the Chinese ambassador nodded in agreement, forcing the French delegate to sit down while glaring at me with undisguised hostility. First, these sanctions will fail, not because Burkina Faso is strong enough to resist alone, but because Africa is united. Continental coordination defeats individual pressure. I let that statement hang in the air, watching as the implications registered across the faces of the Western ambassadors who had grown accustomed to African nations competing against each other for Western favor, undercutting each other in pursuit of foreign investment and development assistance, allowing themselves to be played off against one another through selective application of aid and preferential trade arrangements. The era of divide and conquer was ending, replaced by a new reality of African solidarity that Western powers had not anticipated and did not know how to counter. The sanctions strategy had been designed for a world where African nations would comply out of fear of being isolated themselves, where the threat of being cut off from Western financial systems and markets would force submission, where no African government would risk its own interests to defend another African nation facing Western punishment. But that calculation had failed to account for the transformation that was occurring across the continent, the generational change in leadership, the popular movements demanding genuine sovereignty, and the growing recognition that African nations shared common interests that transcended the artificial divisions inherited from colonial partition. The continental coordination I described was not merely rhetorical solidarity but practical cooperation that had been built systematically over the previous 3 years through the alliance of Sahel states and expanded networks of intelligence sharing, economic integration, and mutual defense commitments. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had established joint military commands, integrated border security, coordinated resource development, and created alternative financial mechanisms that reduced dependence on Western-controlled banking systems. Chad had joined these arrangements despite its historical ties to France, recognizing that its long-term interests lay with African partners rather than with a former colonial power that had manipulated Chadian politics for decades. Senegal was moving in the same direction under new leadership that reflected popular demands for change. Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa had all established various forms of cooperation with the Sahel Alliance, creating a network that spanned the continent and that represented a critical mass of African economic and political power. Second, these sanctions expose UN systems failure. Security Council dominated by 5 permanent members, all former colonial powers or their allies. System designed for 1945 world. Obsolete for 2025 reality. This was the fundamental critique that African nations had been making for decades, but that had gained new urgency and new force in the context of the sanctions debate. The Security Council's structure reflected the power relationships that existed at the end of World War II, when most of Africa remained under colonial rule, and when the victorious Allied powers designed international institutions to preserve their dominance. The 5 permanent members with veto power were the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France, a configuration that gave former colonial powers permanent control over the UN's most powerful body while denying representation to entire continents. Africa, with 54 countries representing over 1 billion people, had no permanent representation on the Security Council. Latin America had no permanent member. The entire Islamic world had no permanent member. The structure was indefensible on democratic grounds, sustainable only through the institutional inertia of established power and the inability of the rest of the world to force reform against the opposition of those who benefited from the current arrangement. The obsolescence of this system had become increasingly apparent as global power relationships shifted, as former colonies developed their own economic and military capabilities, as new powers emerged that had not participated in World War II, and as the legitimacy of institutions that excluded the majority of humanity from meaningful participation came under growing challenge. China had used its permanent membership to protect its interests and to challenge Western dominance, but even Chinese presence on the Council did not address the fundamental problem of African exclusion. Russia had similarly used its veto to block Western initiatives, but Russian support for African positions was tactical rather than principled, driven by great power competition rather than by genuine commitment to reforming the international system. The result was a Security Council that could act decisively only when the permanent members' interests aligned, that was paralyzed by vetoes when those interests diverged, and that lacked legitimacy in the eyes of much of the world that it claimed to govern. The sanctions against Burkina Faso crystallized these contradictions because they exposed how the Security Council could be mobilized rapidly and effectively when Western interests were threatened but remained paralyzed in the face of far greater humanitarian crises when Western powers were not motivated to act. The Council had imposed comprehensive sanctions against Burkina Faso within weeks of our exposure of French intelligence operations, but it had failed to take meaningful action on conflicts that had killed millions, on humanitarian disasters that had displaced tens of millions, on systematic human rights violations by Western allies, or on the climate crisis that threatened the existence of entire nations. The double standard was obvious, the hypocrisy undeniable, and the political nature of the sanctions impossible to disguise behind humanitarian rhetoric or legal formalism. Third, these sanctions accelerate African independence. Every unjust sanction strengthens continental unity. Every abuse of power builds African resolve. This was perhaps the most important point because it identified the fundamental strategic miscalculation that Western powers had made in pursuing sanctions. They had assumed that economic pressure would force African governments to back down, to distance themselves from Burkina Faso, to comply with Western demands out of fear for their own interests. But the sanctions had instead catalyzed exactly the opposite response, galvanizing African solidarity, accelerating economic integration projects that had previously moved slowly, and building popular support for leaders who defied Western pressure. The sanctions had transformed what might have remained a bilateral dispute between Burkina Faso and France into a continental confrontation over African sovereignty, creating a defining moment that forced African nations and African peoples to choose between continued subordination to former colonial powers and genuine independence with all its risks and challenges. Every unjust sanction did indeed strengthen continental unity because it demonstrated that no African nation was safe from Western punishment if it pursued policies contrary to Western interests, that compliance and good behavior provided no protection if fundamental interests were threatened, and that the only real security lay in collective action and mutual defense. Mali had initially hesitated to fully support Burkina Faso's confrontation with France, concerned about potential economic consequences and diplomatic isolation, but the sanctions had made clear that Mali would face similar treatment if it continued to assert independence, making alliance with Burkina Faso a matter of self-preservation rather than ideological solidarity. Niger had experienced a similar calculation, recognizing that its own disputes with France over uranium contracts would inevitably lead to Western punishment unless African nations stood together. Chad, Senegal, and other nations had reached the same conclusion through their own experiences and through observation of the sanctions' political logic. Every abuse of power built African resolve because it destroyed the illusions that had sustained neo-colonial relationships. The belief that Western powers would respect African sovereignty if African nations were reasonable and moderate, that economic development could be achieved through partnership with former colonial powers, that the international system could be reformed from within through patient diplomacy and gradual change. The sanctions demonstrated that Western powers would use every available mechanism to maintain control, that international law and institutional procedures would be manipulated to serve Western interests, that African sovereignty would be tolerated only insofar as it did not threaten Western dominance, and that genuine independence would require confrontation rather than accommodation. This recognition was spreading across the continent, transforming political discourse, energizing popular movements, and creating pressure on African leaders to take stronger positions in defense of sovereignty. Fourth, these sanctions reveal Western desperation. France losing influence in Africa, United States facing African resistance. Western powers using sanctions because other control methods failed. The desperation was evident in the speed and severity of the sanctions, in the transparent political motivations behind humanitarian rhetoric, in the aggressive diplomatic pressure applied to African nations to support the sanctions, and in the increasingly hysterical tone of Western media coverage that portrayed African sovereignty movements as dangerous chaos requiring international intervention. France was indeed losing influence across Francophone Africa as populations rejected the CFA franc currency system, as governments terminated military cooperation agreements, as the exposure of intelligence operations destroyed the credibility of French claims about partnership and cooperation, and as African nations developed alternative relationships with China, Russia, Turkey, and other powers that offered economic engagement without the political conditions and cultural imperialism that characterized French presence. The loss of African influence threatened France's status as a global power, undermined French energy security that depended on African uranium, eliminated French military bases that provided strategic depth for power projection, and destroyed French economic advantages in African markets that had been protected through monetary and trade arrangements inherited from the colonial period. The United States faced similar challenges as African nations increasingly refused to align automatically with American positions in international forums, as African governments rejected American military presence and cooperation programs that served American strategic interests rather than African security needs, as African peoples protested American support for authoritarian regimes and American complicity in resource extraction that enriched multinational corporations while leaving African populations in poverty, and as African intellectuals and activists articulated alternatives to the neoliberal economic model that the United States had promoted through international financial institutions. American influence in Africa had always been less direct than French influence, exercised through economic leverage and security partnerships rather than through the comprehensive political and cultural domination that characterized France-Afrique. But American power was nonetheless in decline as African nations developed greater capacity to resist pressure and as American credibility suffered from military failures, economic crises, and the obvious contradictions between American democratic rhetoric and American support for dictatorships. Western powers were using sanctions because other control methods had indeed failed, because intelligence operations had been exposed and dismantled, because military presence was being ejected, because economic leverage was diminishing as African nations developed alternative partnerships and regional integration, because cultural influence was waning as new generations rejected colonial languages and colonial education systems, and because political manipulation was becoming less effective as African civil society strengthened and as information technology enabled populations to access diverse sources of information rather than relying on Western-controlled media. Sanctions represented a last resort, an admission that soft power had failed and that hard power could not be applied directly without unacceptable costs, leaving economic coercion as the remaining instrument through which Western powers could attempt to punish defiance and deter other African nations from following similar paths. Fifth, these sanctions will be remembered. History will judge this council. History will record this injustice. Future generations will understand what happened here. I spoke these words with absolute conviction because I knew they were true, because I understood that we were living through a historical moment that would be studied and analyzed for generations, because I recognized that the sanctions represented not the reassertion of Western control, but rather the final crisis of the neo-colonial system that had governed Africa since independence. Future historians would look back on this moment and see it as the turning point when African nations collectively rejected subordination, when the international system's illegitimacy became undeniable, when the post-World War II order finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The sanctions would be remembered not as effective punishment that forced compliance, but as the catalyst that accelerated African unity and independence, as the overreach that exposed Western desperation, as the injustice that galvanized resistance across the global South. History would judge this council harshly because the injustice was so transparent, because the double standards were so obvious, because the political motivations were so clear, because the abuse of institutional authority was so blatant. Future generations would study the sanctions as a case study in how international institutions could be captured by powerful states and used as instruments of domination rather than as mechanisms for collective security and international cooperation. They would analyze how the Security Council had imposed comprehensive sanctions against a small African nation for exposing intelligence operations while taking no action against far more serious violations by powerful states, how humanitarian rhetoric had been deployed to disguise political punishment, how international law had been selectively applied to serve the interests of former colonial powers, and how the UN system had failed its fundamental mission of maintaining international peace and security based on sovereign equality. Future generations would understand what happened here because we would ensure that the full record was preserved and disseminated, because we would document every aspect of the sanctions and the resistance to them, because we would teach our children and grandchildren about this moment when Africa stood up and said no to continued domination, because we would make certain that the lessons of this confrontation were learned and remembered, so that future generations would never again submit to the kind of neo-colonial control that we were fighting to eliminate. The historical memory of the sanctions would become part of the foundation of African identity and African solidarity, a shared experience of injustice and resistance that would bind the continent together and that would inform African approaches to international relations for decades to come. I stood, final minute remaining of my allotted speaking time, and I intended to use every second of it to drive home the message that would resonate across Africa and around the world, the message that would define this moment and shape its historical meaning. This council can impose sanctions, can freeze assets, can ban travel, can embargo arms. You have that power. I acknowledge their institutional authority, their legal capacity to take these actions, their control over mechanisms of international economic coercion, because denying the reality of their power would have been foolish and would have undermined my credibility. They did have the power to impose sanctions, to use the UN system to punish states that defied Western interests, to mobilize international financial institutions and Western governments to enforce economic isolation. That power was real, built over decades through the construction of international institutions and economic systems that gave Western powers leverage over nations that depended on access to global markets, international banking systems, development assistance, and security partnerships. Acknowledging this power made my defiance more meaningful, made the resistance more significant, made the challenge to their authority more profound. But you cannot break African unity, cannot destroy continental coordination, cannot eliminate alliance solidarity, cannot prevent African sovereignty. This was the crucial distinction between what they could do and what they could achieve, between their institutional power and their actual capacity to accomplish their objectives, between imposing sanctions and forcing submission. They could freeze Burkina Faso assets held in Western financial institutions, but they could not prevent African nations from developing alternative financial systems that bypassed Western control. They could ban travel by Burkina Faso officials to Western countries, but they could not prevent those officials from traveling throughout Africa and to non-Western nations that refused to enforce the sanctions. They could embargo arms sales to Burkina Faso, but they could not prevent us from obtaining weapons from Russia, China, or other sources, and they could not prevent us from developing our own domestic arms production capabilities. They could impose economic costs, but they could not break our will, could not destroy the solidarity that had been built through shared experience of neo-colonial exploitation, could not eliminate the determination to achieve genuine sovereignty regardless of the price. African unity was not something that could be destroyed by sanctions because it was rooted in shared history, common interests, and collective recognition that our fates were intertwined, that no African nation could be truly independent while others remained subordinated, that continental solidarity was essential for African development and African security. Continental coordination had been built through years of patient work, establishing institutions, developing relationships, creating mechanisms for cooperation, and demonstrating through practice that African nations could work together effectively to advance shared interests. Alliance solidarity within the Sahel states had been forged through joint operations, integrated planning, mutual support in crisis, and the bonds that developed among leaders and populations who had stood together against common threats. African sovereignty was an idea whose time had come, a demand that reflected the aspirations of hundreds of millions of people who refused to accept continued domination, a political force that could not be stopped by economic pressure or institutional manipulation. You can sanction Burkina Faso, but you cannot sanction Africa's future. You can punish my government, but you cannot punish African determination. The distinction was critical because it separated the immediate tactical situation from the broader strategic trajectory, the short-term costs from the long-term outcome, the temporary pain from the permanent transformation. Yes, they could sanction Burkina Faso, could impose economic costs on our government and our people, could make our situation more difficult and our path more challenging. Yes, they could punish my government specifically, could target me personally with travel bans and asset freezes, could attempt to isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically and economically, but none of this could change the fundamental direction of African history, could not reverse the tide of African sovereignty movements, could not restore the neo-colonial system that was collapsing across the continent, could not prevent the emergence of a new generation of African leaders and African peoples who refused to accept subordination. Africa's future would be determined by Africans, not by former colonial powers attempting to maintain control through economic coercion and institutional manipulation. That future would be built on African unity, African resources, African capabilities, and African determination to achieve genuine independence and development on our own terms. The sanctions might slow that process, might impose costs and create challenges, might force us to take more difficult paths and to make greater sacrifices. But they could not stop the process, could not prevent the eventual achievement of African sovereignty, could not maintain permanent Western domination over a continent of over 1 billion people with immense resources and growing capabilities. African determination was not something that could be punished into submission because it was rooted in the lived experience of neo-colonial exploitation, in the daily reality of poverty amid plenty, in the knowledge that Africa's resources were being extracted for the benefit of others, in the recognition that the international system was rigged against African interests, in the understanding that genuine development required genuine sovereignty. This determination had been building for generations, expressed in independence movements, in Pan-African solidarity, in popular protests against structural adjustment and neoliberal policies, in demands for reparations and justice, in cultural movements reclaiming African identity and African dignity. The sanctions would not break this determination but would instead strengthen it by demonstrating once again that Western powers would use every available tool to maintain domination, that accommodation and moderation would not be rewarded with respect and partnership, that the only path to sovereignty was through confrontation and resistance. These sanctions are unjust, these sanctions are hypocritical, these sanctions are illegitimate, and these sanctions will fail. I stated each point separately and emphatically, making clear that this was not mere rhetoric but a considered judgment based on careful analysis of the sanctions' legal basis, political motivations, and practical prospects. The sanctions were unjust because they punished Burkina Faso for exposing French intelligence operations that violated our sovereignty, because they treated the victim as the aggressor and protected the perpetrator, because they imposed collective punishment on the Burkinabe people for the actions of their government, because they threatened food security and humanitarian conditions in one of the world's poorest countries. The injustice was not merely moral but legal, violating principles of proportionality, necessity, and humanitarian protection that were supposed to govern Security Council actions, even when those actions were authorized under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. The sanctions were hypocritical because the nations imposing them had themselves engaged in far worse violations of international law and sovereignty without facing any consequences. Because France had conducted intelligence operations across Africa for decades without punishment, because the United States had invaded multiple countries and overthrown numerous governments without sanctions, because the United Kingdom had participated in illegal wars and supported authoritarian regimes throughout the post-colonial period without accountability. The hypocrisy extended to the selective application of humanitarian concerns, with the Security Council expressing sudden worry about conditions in Burkina Faso while ignoring far worse humanitarian crises in countries that maintained good relations with Western powers, while supporting regimes that committed systematic human rights violations, while blocking action on Palestine, Yemen, and other situations where Western interests or Western allies were implicated. The sanctions were illegitimate because they reflected not the collective judgment of the international community, but rather the particular interests of former colonial powers using their institutional advantages to punish defiance, because they lacked support from the majority of UN member states who were pressured or bribed into abstaining rather than voting against, because they violated the principle of sovereign equality that was supposed to be the foundation of the UN system, because they represented an abuse of Security Council authority that undermined the legitimacy of the institution itself. Legitimacy in international relations requires not just legal authority but also moral justification and broad acceptance, and the sanctions possessed none of these beyond the narrow circle of Western powers and their closest allies. The sanctions would fail because African unity would prevent their effective enforcement, because alternative partnerships would provide the economic and security support that Western sanctions sought to deny, because the political costs of the sanctions would exceed their economic impact by galvanizing resistance and accelerating independence movements, because the sanctions had exposed Western desperation and illegitimacy in ways that could not be undone, and because the historical trajectory was moving toward African sovereignty, regardless of Western efforts to maintain control. Failure did not mean that the sanctions would have no effect or impose no costs, but rather that they would not achieve their intended objective of forcing Burkina Faso to submit to Western demands, that they would not deter other African nations from pursuing similar paths, that they would not restore French influence or Western dominance, and that they would ultimately be remembered as a failed attempt to preserve a dying system rather than as an effective assertion of international authority. Burkina Faso rejects them. Africa rejects them. History will reject them. The three-part rejection captured the immediate, continental, and historical dimensions of resistance to the sanctions. Burkina Faso's rejection was formal and official, a clear statement that we would not comply with sanctions we considered unjust and illegitimate, that we would not modify our policies in response to economic coercion, that we would accept the costs of defiance rather than submit to neo-colonial pressure. This rejection had practical implications for sanctions enforcement because it meant that our government would actively work to circumvent sanctions rather than facilitating their implementation, would seek alternative sources for goods and services that sanctions sought to deny, would mobilize domestic resources and popular support to mitigate economic impacts, and would use the sanctions as evidence of Western hostility to build solidarity with other nations facing similar pressure. Africa's rejection was broader and more significant because it meant that the sanctions would lack the continental support necessary for effective enforcement, that African nations would refuse to implement sanctions measures within their own jurisdictions, that African regional organizations would condemn the sanctions and work to mitigate their impact, and that African peoples would see the sanctions as an attack on African sovereignty rather than as legitimate international action. This continental rejection transformed the sanctions from an isolated punishment of one small nation into a defining confrontation between Africa and the West, between the demand for genuine sovereignty and the defense of neo-colonial control, between an emerging multipolar world order and the desperate attempt to preserve Western dominance. History's rejection was certain because the injustice was too obvious, the hypocrisy too blatant, the political motivations too transparent for future generations to view the sanctions as anything other than an abuse of power and an illegitimate attempt to punish African sovereignty. Historical judgment would be shaped by the documentary record we were creating, by the testimony we were preserving, by the analysis we were conducting, and by the outcome of the confrontation, which would demonstrate either that sanctions could force submission or that resistance could prevail. I was confident that history would reject the sanctions because I believed that resistance would prevail, that African unity would prove stronger than Western pressure, that the trajectory toward African sovereignty was irreversible, and that future generations would look back on this moment as the beginning of the end of neo-colonial domination. I looked directly at the camera, not at the ambassadors sitting in the Security Council chamber, at Africa, at the hundreds of millions of people watching across the continent and throughout the diaspora, at the students in universities and the workers in markets and the farmers in fields and the soldiers in barracks, at everyone who had experienced neo-colonial exploitation and who longed for genuine independence, at the new generation that refused to accept the subordination that their parents and grandparents had endured, at the movements demanding change and the leaders finding courage to confront Western power. To African people, your leaders stand with you. Your sovereignty is defended. Your unity is strong. These sanctions cannot stop us. This message was more important than anything I said to the Security Council because it spoke directly to the source of our strength and the foundation of our resistance. African people needed to know that they were not alone, that their governments were defending their interests rather than selling them out to foreign powers, that the sovereignty they demanded was being protected despite Western pressure, that the unity they called for was being built in practice through concrete cooperation and mutual support, and that the sanctions would not force their leaders to abandon them or to submit to continued domination. The message was meant to provide encouragement during the difficult period ahead, when sanctions would impose real costs, to build confidence that resistance could succeed, to strengthen popular support for governments facing Western pressure, and to reinforce the connection between leaders and peoples that was essential for sustained confrontation with powerful external forces. Your leaders stand with you was a promise and a commitment, a statement that we understood our responsibility to defend popular interests, even when that defense required confrontation with powerful external actors, that we would not be bought off or intimidated into abandoning the sovereignty agenda, that we recognized our legitimacy derived from popular support rather than from Western recognition or approval. This commitment distinguished the current generation of African leaders from previous generations who had often prioritized their own survival and enrichment over popular interests, who had collaborated with neo-colonial powers in exchange for personal benefits, who had used state violence against their own populations while maintaining friendly relations with Western governments. The new generation of leaders emerging across Africa understood that their political survival depended on delivering genuine sovereignty and development, that populations would no longer tolerate leaders who served foreign interests, and that the era of comprador elites was ending. Your sovereignty is defended was a statement of fact about current actions rather than a promise about future intentions, an assurance that we were actively working to protect African sovereignty through intelligence operations that expose neo-colonial mechanisms, through economic policies that reduced dependence on Western financial systems, through security cooperation that eliminated foreign military presence, through diplomatic initiatives that built alternative partnerships, and through cultural programs that reclaimed African identity and dignity. The defense of sovereignty was not passive resistance to Western pressure, but active construction of the capabilities and institutions necessary for genuine independence. Not merely saying no to Western demands, but building the capacity to chart our own course and pursue our own interests. Your unity is strong was both description and aspiration, acknowledging the real progress that had been made in building African solidarity, while also calling for continued effort to strengthen continental cooperation. The unity was strong in the sense that 26 African nations had coordinated their rejection of the sanctions, that the alliance of Sahel states had created genuine integration among member nations, that intelligence services were sharing information and conducting joint operations, that economic cooperation was reducing dependence on Western markets and financial systems, and that popular movements across the continent were demanding and supporting Pan-African solidarity. But the unity needed to become stronger still, needed to expand to include more nations, needed to deepen through more comprehensive integration, needed to develop more robust institutions and mechanisms for collective action, and needed to be sustained through the difficult period of confrontation and transition that lay ahead. These sanctions cannot stop us was the fundamental message, the core assertion that had to be communicated clearly and repeatedly so that African peoples would not lose hope when sanctions imposed costs, so that they would understand that temporary difficulties were the price of permanent liberation, so that they would maintain support for resistance, even when Western propaganda portrayed sanctions as the inevitable consequence of reckless leadership, and so that they would recognize that submission would not end suffering, but would only ensure its continuation under different forms. The sanctions could not stop us, because our determination was stronger than their pressure, because our unity provided alternatives to Western economic systems, because our resources were sufficient for our needs if we controlled them ourselves, because our capabilities were growing while theirs were declining, and because history was moving in our direction regardless of their desperate attempts to reverse the tide. To Western powers, your sanctions reveal your desperation, your abuse of UN exposes your weakness, you're losing control, and sanctions won't restore it. This message was equally important because it spoke directly to the source of the sanctions and challenged the narrative that Western powers were projecting about their actions. Western governments were portraying the sanctions as a measured response to Burkina Faso violations of international norms, as a necessary defense of intelligence, cooperation, and diplomatic immunity, as a legitimate use of Security Council authority to maintain international order. But this narrative was false, and it was important to expose the truth about Western motivations and Western weakness so that other nations considering resistance would understand that Western power was not as formidable as it appeared, that Western dominance was eroding, and that the moment for challenging that dominance had arrived. Your sanctions reveal your desperation because confident powers do not need to impose comprehensive economic coercion against small nations that expose their intelligence operations, because powers secure in their legitimacy do not need to abuse international institutions to punish criticism, because powers comfortable with their position do not react with such fury to challenges from nations they claim to regard as partners. The desperation was evident in the speed of the sanctions, in their severity relative to the supposed offense, in the aggressive diplomacy pressuring other nations to support them, in the hysterical media coverage portraying African sovereignty movements as chaos requiring intervention, and in the obvious fear that what was happening in Burkina Faso might spread across the continent and throughout the global south. Powers that were truly strong and secure would have responded to the exposure of intelligence operations with diplomatic protests and perhaps targeted measures against specific individuals, not with comprehensive sanctions designed to cripple an entire nation's economy. Your abuse of UN exposes your weakness because it demonstrated that Western powers could no longer rely on softer forms of influence and had to resort to crude institutional manipulation, because it showed that they feared losing control over international institutions that they had dominated since their creation, because it revealed that they understood the UN's legitimacy was already fragile and that obvious abuse would further undermine it, but they felt they had no choice. Strong powers can afford to respect institutional procedures and norms because those procedures generally serve their interests, but weak powers facing challenges to their dominance must abuse institutions to maintain control, must use their structural advantages before those advantages erode further, must act decisively, even if such action undermines the legitimacy of the institutions themselves. The abuse of the UN exposed Western weakness by showing that Western powers no longer felt confident that they could maintain dominance through the normal operation of international institutions and felt compelled to manipulate those institutions in ways that destroyed their credibility. Your losing control was the fundamental reality that Western powers refused to acknowledge publicly, but that drove their increasingly desperate actions. France was losing control in Africa as military bases were closed, as the CFA franc system faced growing rejection, as intelligence networks were exposed and dismantled, as French companies lost privileged access to African resources and markets, and as French cultural influence waned among new generations. The United States was losing control globally as its military interventions failed, as its economic dominance eroded, as its political model lost appeal, as its hypocrisy became undeniable, and as alternative poles of power emerged. The entire Western-dominated international order was losing control as the global South demanded reform, as non-Western powers gained economic and military capabilities, as populations rejected neoliberal policies, as the legitimacy of post-World War II institutions collapsed, and as the historical moment of Western dominance that began with colonialism came to its inevitable end. And sanctions won't restore it because economic coercion could not reverse historical processes, could not eliminate the capabilities that non-Western nations had developed, could not restore the legitimacy that Western powers had squandered through hypocrisy and abuse, could not prevent the emergence of alternative systems and partnerships, and could not break the determination of peoples who had decided that genuine sovereignty was worth whatever price had to be paid. Sanctions might slow the process of Western decline and non-Western emergence, might impose costs on nations that challenged Western dominance, might deter some potential resistors through demonstration of Western willingness to use economic weapons. But sanctions could not fundamentally alter the trajectory because that trajectory was driven by deeper forces, by demography that was shifting global population toward the global South, by economics that was shifting productive capacity toward Asia and resource wealth toward Africa and Latin America, by technology that was diffusing capabilities beyond Western control, by politics that was generating new forms of organization and governance, and by culture that was reasserting non-Western identities and rejecting Western universalist claims. I walked out, didn't wait for Security Council response, didn't remain to hear Western ambassadors defend their actions or to engage in procedural debates about sanctions implementation or to participate in the diplomatic theater that would follow my speech. 11 minutes. Everything changed. My statement was complete. My message delivered, my position established. Remaining in the chamber would have suggested that I sought their approval or feared their judgment or accepted their authority to sit in judgment of Burkina Faso. Walking out was itself a statement, a rejection not just of the sanctions but of the entire framework within which the Security Council claimed to operate, a refusal to participate in a system that was fundamentally illegitimate and irredeemably biased against African interests. African ambassadors stood, applauding, following me out, Mali, Niger, Chad, Senegal, Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, 26 ambassadors, continental walkout, unified protest. The applause began with the ambassadors from the Alliance of Sahel States who had coordinated this response in advance, who had committed to walk out regardless of the personal and professional consequences, who understood that this moment required dramatic action that would capture global attention and demonstrate African unity. But the applause and the walkout spread beyond the core alliance as other African ambassadors made split-second decisions to join the protest, some following instructions from capitals that had been waiting to see how the situation developed, others acting on their own initiative in response to the power of the moment and the clear injustice of the sanctions, all of them recognizing that this was a defining moment that would be remembered and that would shape their own legacies and their nation's positions in the emerging continental order. Security Council chamber half empty, Western ambassadors in shock, authority challenged, legitimacy questioned. The visual impact was devastating, with television cameras capturing the image of African ambassadors walking out en masse while Western ambassadors sat in stunned silence, with the gallery erupting in excited conversation, with the Council President uncertain how to proceed in the face of such an unprecedented challenge to Security Council authority. The walkout was not merely symbolic protest, but a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of the Security Council's action, a statement that the sanctions lacked the support of the nations most affected by them, a demonstration that African nations were no longer willing to participate in their own subordination, even when that subordination was dressed up in the language of international law and collective security. Western ambassadors had not anticipated this response because they had grown accustomed to African compliance, to African nations voting against their own interests when pressured by threats of aid cuts or promises of benefits, to African ambassadors making speeches of protest but ultimately accepting decisions made by more powerful nations. The shock on their faces reflected not just surprise at the immediate walkout, but recognition that something fundamental had changed, that the assumptions underlying their approach to Africa were no longer valid, that the mechanisms of control that had worked for decades were breaking down, and that they faced a genuinely new situation for which their diplomatic playbooks offered no effective response. The French ambassador in particular looked devastated, understanding that this moment represented the public collapse of France-Afrique, the end of France's ability to control African nations through the combination of economic dependence, military presence, political manipulation, and cultural influence that had sustained French power in Africa since decolonization. I held press conference immediately. 11 minutes ago, I addressed Security Council about unjust sanctions. 26 African ambassadors just walked out, continental solidarity, unified rejection. The press conference had been planned in advance, with our communications team ready to move immediately after my speech to ensure that our narrative would dominate initial media coverage before Western governments and media outlets could establish their own framing of events. The location was carefully chosen, a room in the UN building but outside the Security Council chamber, symbolically remaining within the UN system while rejecting the authority of the particular decision. The attendance was massive, with journalists from around the world packed into the space, cameras from every major network broadcasting live, and reporters shouting questions in multiple languages. The statement was deliberately brief and clear, designed to provide a soundbite that would be repeated across all media platforms, that would capture the essence of what had happened in language accessible to global audiences, that would frame the event as African unity rather than as Burkina Faso isolation. 11 minutes emphasized the brevity of my speech and the efficiency with which I had delivered a comprehensive critique of the sanctions and the system that produced them. 26 African ambassadors quantified the scale of the walkout and demonstrated that this was not the action of a few radical nations but represented a broad continental consensus. Continental solidarity and unified rejection were the key phrases, the message that needed to be communicated and repeated and reinforced so that the world would understand this as a collective African response rather than as the isolated defiance of one small nation. Within hours, global reaction exploded. China questioned sanctions' legitimacy through a foreign ministry statement expressing concern about the use of Security Council authority to punish nations for defending their sovereignty and calling for dialogue rather than coercion. Russia expressed concerns through its UN ambassador, who noted that the sanctions appeared politically motivated and who questioned whether they met the legal requirements for Chapter 7 action. India criticized the process through a carefully worded statement that avoided direct confrontation with Western powers, but that noted the importance of respecting sovereignty and the dangers of using sanctions as a political weapon. Brazil opposed the approach through its foreign ministry, which called for mediation and negotiation rather than punishment, and which noted that comprehensive sanctions often harmed civilian populations more than governments. Global South solidarity was building as nations that had their own grievances against Western dominance and their own fears of being targeted by similar sanctions recognized that Burkina Faso's resistance served their interests as well. The reactions from major non-Western powers were significant because they provided diplomatic cover for African resistance, because they demonstrated that Burkina Faso was not isolated globally, even if isolated within the Western-dominated Security Council, and because they signaled that the emerging multipolar order was consolidating around opposition to Western unilateralism and abuse of international institutions. China's support was particularly important given its economic weight and its position as a permanent Security Council member that could block future sanctions or other punitive measures. Russia's support was valuable because of its military capabilities and its willingness to provide security assistance to nations facing Western pressure. India's support mattered because of its growing economic and political influence and its leadership role in the global South. Brazil's support was significant because of its regional influence and its role in movements for international institutional reform. Western powers proposed expanded sanctions. Burkina Faso's rejection of Security Council authority requires stronger response. The proposal came within days of the walkout, driven by fury at the public humiliation and by determination to demonstrate that challenging Western power would have consequences. The expanded sanctions would have included secondary sanctions against nations and companies that violated the initial sanctions, would have targeted additional sectors of the Burkinabe economy, would have imposed personal sanctions on more government officials and military officers, and would have authorized potential military enforcement if the sanctions were not implemented effectively. The proposal was presented in legal language about the need to ensure compliance with Security Council decisions and about the importance of maintaining the authority of the UN's primary security organ, but the political motivations were transparent. But something had changed. African ambassadors returned to chamber, not to comply, to challenge. The return was carefully coordinated, with African ambassadors entering together and taking their seats in a block, visually demonstrating their unity and their collective intent. They returned not because they had reconsidered their position or because they had been pressured into submission, but because they intended to use the Security Council chamber itself as a platform for challenging the expanded sanctions and for making clear that African opposition was absolute and unshakable. The decision to return rather than to maintain the walkout reflected strategic calculation that the initial walkout had achieved its symbolic purpose and that the next phase required direct confrontation within the institutional setting. Mali's ambassador spoke. Mali rejects expanded sanctions. Original sanctions were unjust. Additional sanctions are vindictive. The statement was brief and clear, establishing Mali's position without extensive elaboration or justification. The characterization of expanded sanctions as vindictive was important because it moved beyond legal and procedural arguments to identify the emotional and political motivations behind Western actions, because it suggested that Western powers were acting out of wounded pride rather than principled concern for international order, and because it implied that the sanctions were about punishment and control rather than about any legitimate security or humanitarian objectives. The brevity of the statement was itself significant, suggesting that Mali felt no need to justify its position extensively or to persuade Western powers of anything, that Mali was simply declaring its position as a matter of sovereign right. One by one, African ambassadors spoke. Continental rejection. Each statement was brief. Each was clear in rejecting the expanded sanctions. Each emphasized sovereignty and unity. And together they created an overwhelming impression of continental consensus that could not be dismissed or ignored. The statements varied in their specific emphases, with some focusing on legal arguments about the improper use of Security Council authority, others emphasizing the humanitarian costs of sanctions, still others highlighting the political motivations behind Western actions. But all converged on absolute rejection of expanded sanctions and on defense of Burkina Faso's right to expose intelligence operations and to pursue sovereign policies. The cumulative effect was powerful, demonstrating that this was not merely the position of a few radical governments but represented the view of African nations across different regions, different political systems, different economic situations, and different historical relationships with Western powers. Western powers didn't have votes. Expanded sanctions failed. The mathematics of the Security Council worked against Western powers because they needed 9 affirmative votes out of 15 members to pass any resolution, and they could not achieve that threshold when African members voted against, when China and Russia voted against or abstained, and when other non-Western members refused to support obvious overreach. The failure was humiliating because Western powers had publicly proposed expanded sanctions as a response to Burkina Faso's defiance, because they had invested diplomatic capital in pushing for the measures, because they had framed the vote as a test of Security Council authority, and because the defeat demonstrated that they could no longer command automatic majorities, even in an institution that they had dominated since its creation. The failure had implications beyond the immediate question of Burkina Faso sanctions, because it suggested that the Security Council might no longer be a reliable instrument for Western powers to use in pursuing their interests, that the institutional advantages they had built into the UN system were eroding, and that the emerging multipolar order was manifesting even within institutions designed to preserve Western dominance. I issued statement from Ouagadougou. Security Council rejected expanded sanctions. Western powers failed to punish our sovereignty defense. African unity defeated neo-colonial pressure. The statement was issued from the capital rather than from New York to emphasize that I was focused on governing Burkina Faso rather than on diplomatic theater, to demonstrate that I was not waiting anxiously for Security Council decisions, but was continuing to lead my nation regardless of external pressure, and to show that the center of action was in Africa rather than in Western-dominated international institutions. The characterization of the vote as Western failure rather than as Burkinabe victory was deliberate, framing the situation as Western powers attempting something and failing rather than as Burkina Faso defending against attack, suggesting that the initiative lay with those seeking to maintain domination rather than with those seeking liberation. I am Ibrahim Traoré. UN Security Council imposed red-level sanctions. I responded with 11-minute speech. Western powers expected submission. I delivered defiance. This self-identification in summary encapsulated my understanding of my role and my approach to the confrontation with Western powers. I was not a diplomat seeking accommodation or a technocrat managing relationships, but a revolutionary leader defending sovereignty and challenging domination. The sanctions were the most severe level of economic coercion short of military action, designed to force submission through comprehensive economic pressure. My response was not to negotiate or to seek compromise, but to deliver a speech that challenged the legitimacy of the sanctions and the system that produced them, that rallied African support for resistance, and that demonstrated absolute refusal to submit regardless of consequences.